One of the things that I wanted to do for this audience, first of all, I should tell you
Sure.
kind of who the people are. They're according to the people that we're presenting, they're going to be firefighters. They're going to be people who are public education people who sort of set up programs in the community, and other people like that. So mostly fire people.
Right.
So one of the things I want you to do from the sort of inside out, from the perspective of a person with autism, can you just describe what is autism from your perspective?
Sure.
And it might not be what everybody else thinks, but that's okay. We don't care.
Sure. If it gets dictionary, just don't tell me.
I won't.
So it's mental. I want to say condition, but condition sounds a little bit too temporary. So it's a mental property.
Okay.
Which consists of somewhat obsessive behavior, in general, sort of lack of an ability to be perfectly social, or typically social anyways, and especially when it comes to understanding nonverbal communication and nonverbal cues. And it also, you're generally somewhat obsessive, not necessarily on any particular topic. In fact, the things people obsess about vary, and it's pretty regular to have some difficulty with pure communication. I think that about sums it up.
Great. One of the things I wanted to know, do you think autism is positive or negative from your perspective, for you?
For me, I would argue the issue is it's such an intrinsic trait that I don't necessarily know if positive or negative work as things, because I can't really imagine what I would think or how I would think if I wasn't. So, I mean, obviously there are downsides and positives, but at least for me, it helps me focus on things to an extent that I don't think I would do if I wasn't autistic.
What about math? Do you think you would be as good in math if you were?
Probably not, but again, I don't know how my brain would work, so...
Yeah, well, I remember when you were little, and math, it was your great love.
Well, no, it still is. That's not the reason. I'm just saying I don't know what I would be like if I wasn't autistic, so...
Right.
It's...
Yeah. But your life is pretty darn good.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy.
Yeah, I think you are too. Okay, at what age did you notice that people were treating you differently, or did you ever notice that? Maybe they don't.
So I guess I had some awareness around when I was maybe first grade, kindergarten. The issue is, I don't think I realized I was autistic per se so much as I wasn't being social with other kids. And I'm not even sure that I was the first one to notice it, but my parents and teachers and everyone else who was basically responsible for me noticed it and tried to intervene, much to my chagrin. I was perfectly happy. I didn't feel like I needed anyone to intervene, but they wanted me to be more social, and I think I noticed it then. And I mean, I think I learned I was autistic when I was about 8, but I don't really remember. And I don't think, at least now, people generally treat me differently. Like, I was having a conversation with a friend about colleges today, and we were talking about my autism getting in, and I said, right, but I have autism, and that means I can write an essay about that, and that's going to be useful in terms of distinguishing me. And he said, I keep on forgetting that you're autistic.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah. That's really something. Which leads me to, I wanted you to talk a little bit about your journey from novice to expert. That's such a great story, you know. And these folks won't know what novice and expert are, but I would like for you to talk a little bit about that.
So, I worked with Glenda here since I was in kindergarten. like weekly until 4th grade, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And so for the first few years, I was in a play group. Basically, what I do with Glenda I did with Glenda, was I would work with peers and work with her, and I would say be tricked into being social. Because I would be put in situations where I was demanded to be social, but they weren't explicit demands. They were more, for example, some things like playing pretend or riding on swings. And so you'd have to request things from people, and that would force you to communicate, and the activities would force you to be social without making it artificial. And I continued that until 2nd grade, and I had 2 peers helping me along with Glenda, Brian and Cody. And after I was in 2nd grade, I quote-unquote graduated to the next level. So normally what would happen is I would stop working with Glenda, but I really, really didn't want to do that. So I think what ended up happening is instead I moved to an intermediate stage where I would work with another kid with Glenda, and I would try and help him out, and play the role that Cody and Brian had played for me, which was not very typical because I wasn't socially normal, and normally the people who would play that role were. And so then, eventually, I worked with somebody else besides Glenda, and I worked with another kid, and I basically had to be independent and try and do the role of helping somebody out without, I want to say, a crutch. And I think that's when I officially graduated to expert. And then I could go back with Glenda because I had proven that I could do it without her.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great story. And I remember the story of you talking about Ben and the difference in autism. Do you remember that story about the ice cream?
I don't actually remember it. I remember the story.
You do? Yeah, that was a great story. Can you just...
Sure. Apparently, and you know how when you're a kid you say things and everyone else remembers them and you have no memory of the situation. So when I was in the intermediate phase, I worked with a kid called Ben Hillgrove, and what I did, and I was asked what the difference between being, I think, an intermediate or an expert and a novice was, and I have an incredible sweet tooth, so I loved ice cream at the time. So I said, the difference is when you're a novice, you can take 2 scoops of ice cream, which at the time felt really excessive to me. But when you're an expert, you have to be a role model. You have to take 1 scoop of ice cream.
Yeah, that was on tape, and that was such a great, metaphor for the difference. I like that a lot. By the way, Cody wants to be a firefighter, and I saw him recently, and it was just so cool to see him. It really was fun. What do you think, what characteristics of autism make emergencies particularly difficult? Like, for example, for you or a person with autism, or for the first responders. So say there was a house on fire and,
Right.
the sensory piece. Can you talk a little bit about
Right.
that?
As I think I mentioned earlier, if you're autistic, you get obsessive, and what that means is you can get completely lost in your own head and your own thoughts, and also you can be really sensitive to external stimuluses like light or sound or that. And obviously when there's a fire, there's a lot of external stimuluses, so you can get overwhelmed, and by being overwhelmed, you can't react as copacetically as somebody without autism would be, which puts you in more danger, and it makes it harder to communicate with an emergency worker who would be working with you.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. Let's see. The other thing I want to ask is if you would were to develop a community education program for a fire department, what do you think is important to include? For example, say you're a public education person, you want to set up a program for little kindergarten kids to come visit the firehouse, and maybe 2 or 3 of those kids have special needs. What would you recommend to the fire personnel, and how could they best set up that program to make it really, really good?
I mean, clearly you don't want to put kindergartners in the middle of a fire. That would probably have some ethical problems, and it would probably have some legal problems as well.
Probably.
But
so you don't want to go to jail,
but,
okay.
Besides that, you probably do want to have some sort of simulation of what would go on, which I could imagine kids, autistic and non-autistic, would find useful, and especially autistic. So when it actually happens, you probably at least be able to draw on something, and thus be more able to cope with the situation, even if you're still overwhelmed and still panicked.
So like a stop, drop, and roll, and you demonstrate and have the kids do it, that would be good to do.
That would be good to do, and maybe having a toy, not a toy, a model house where you pretend it's on fire. You don't actually make it on fire, and they have to get out, and they have to feel the doors, and they have to do that.
So
it
maybe
depends on the budget.
They have a trailer that they use here at Woodside that's sort of for that, so you think that experiential will be really good. What about visual supports, like, big cue boards that say, here's the schedule, here's what we're doing, what do you think about that? Do you think visual supports help?
I think visual supports help, but I just think, again, experiential is probably the way that's going to be most effective, especially with autistic kids. I can't fully speak for non-autistic kids, but if you actually experience it, you're more likely to remember. And also, there needs to be, and also, it's just more like the actual situation because, or to use an analogy, we regularly have earthquake drills in school, and the running joke is when there's actually an earthquake, no one's going to actually do that because it's so obvious that what's going on and that it's a drill and that the people have learned to not take it seriously. So if you have some sort of experiential thing and it's somewhat authentic, you're going to make a much deeper impact on people than if you're just looking at a chart.
That's a good point. What do you think about, like, if the person that's giving the in-service or whatever you call it, the tour, what about, like, they're wearing their radios that kind of go off and they're loud and they have their helmets on, and what do you think about all that? Do you think for a kindergartner with special needs, would that be better to turn down or warn the kids or tell them to cover their ears?
I don't know if it's how possible it will be to turn down, so I'm not going to comment on that. But it would definitely be good to at least give them a warning that there's going to be that kind of sound, because otherwise you're going to get frazzled when you hear a loud sound going off.
Yeah, and little kids do anyway, yeah, and you never know. Okay, and now what I wanted to know is, what are you going to do from here? I know you're going to go off to college, but what are your hopes and dreams? What do you...
I eventually want to become an academic, which basically means I'm going to be in school for the next 10 years, and then after being in school for the next 10 years, I get to be in an interim purgatory process, purgatorial process, where you're a sort of teacher for a few years, and then you get to be an assistant teacher, and then you're going to be an actual teacher. So basically, I get to train till I'm 38 for a salary that caps out at about $70,000. But I want to study math, and it's the best way to do it, and it would be a really fulfilling career.
So you'd be